In 1891, outside Alder Ridge, Idaho Territory, a solitary ex-trail cowboy named Jonah Creel, 46 years old, with no ranch, no family, and no claim on anyone's future, trades his last $40 for an abandoned line shack beside a mountain stream. With salvaged timber, moss chinking, and a stone chimney, he quietly turns the ruin into something tight and warm and real. But when an early snow season strands travelers and ranch hands on the ridge, the drifter everyone laughed at becomes the one man everyone depends on. The snow comes sideways on the night Jonah Creel saves 4 lives. He does not think of it that way. He thinks only of the fire, whether the stones will hold their heat, whether the moss chinking between the timbers will keep the wind from finding the old seams along the north wall. Outside, the ridge has disappeared entirely behind white. The pines have become suggestions. The road from Alder Ridge, if a frozen rut through sagebrush deserves that name, is gone. Inside the shack, a woman is wringing out a child's stocking near the hearth. 2 ranch hands sit against the wall with their knees drawn up, watching the flames with the particular stillness of men who recently understood they might die. The kettle whistles. Jonah lifts it without ceremony and begins to pour. Nobody is laughing at him now. 15 months earlier, on a Tuesday in September when the sky above Idaho Territory was still the clean, indifferent blue of early autumn, Jonah Creel drove a borrowed mule cart up a rutted track toward a building that generous people called a line shack and honest people called a wreck. He had $41 left. The shack had cost him $40. The man who sold it, a cattleman named Alder Ridge who ran cattle on the upper meadows and had no use for the structure since a creek had shifted and the fence line had moved, shook Jonah's hand with visible pity. "You know what that place is?" Fitch said. "It's the thing folks drive past to feel better about where they're headed." Jonah had nodded slowly. He had been, for most of his adult life, the thing people drove past. But a place could be remade. He believed that in the plain, practical way a carpenter believes in level, not as poetry, but as a working principle. Whatever had been abandoned could be made useful again. He had nothing else to believe in, so he chose to believe in that. The shack sat 40 yards off the main track, up a short rise with its back against a stand of old-growth Douglas fir and its face pointing south toward the valley. Those were, Jonah decided on first inspection, the only 2 things it had going for it. Everything else required attention. The roof had a sag along the ridge beam that caught snow like a bowl. 3 of the 4 window frames had lost their oilskin coverings and stood open to whatever weather chose to visit. The door hung from one hinge and had swollen so badly at the bottom that it scraped a deep arc into the dirt floor every time it moved, which meant it hadn't moved much. The stone chimney stood intact, a genuine surprise, but the firebox was packed with 5 years of bird nests and the detritus of small, industrious animals. The floor was dirt. The walls were hewn pine logs with gaps between them wide enough to post a letter through. A mountain stream ran 20 yards to the east, which Fitch had mentioned as if it were a selling point and which Jonah recognized as the single legitimate advantage of the property. Fresh water without hauling. In winter, that mattered enormously. He stood in the doorway for a long time with his hands in his coat pockets, taking an inventory not of what was there, but of what was possible. He had done this work before, in a different sense. 31 years of trailing cattle from Texas north had taught him to look at a situation and identify its actual shape rather than its apparent one. A stampede looked like chaos. It had a shape. A flooded crossing looked impassable. It had a line through it if you found it. The shack looked like a ruin. It had a structure still, underneath the neglect. He started with the chimney. He spent the first 3 days clearing the firebox with a length of green willow in his bare hands, pulling out compacted debris in layers, working carefully so the stones above wouldn't shift. The chimney was laid dry, no mortar, which meant every stone needed to be sound and well seated. He found 2 that had worked loose near the top and climbed up in the early morning while the dew was still on the fir boughs to reset them. He chinked the small gaps with river clay. He packed up the rise in his hat, 4 trips, letting each layer dry before adding the next. When he finally lit the first fire, on the evening of the 4th day, the draw was clean and strong. The smoke went up without complaint. He sat on the dirt floor with his back against the stone base and felt the heat come through the rock into his spine and thought, good. One true thing. The roof came next. He felled 2 straight pines from the fir stand behind the shack, working with a crosscut saw he'd carried in the mule cart. The mule was borrowed and returned. The saw was his, and split the timber into lengths that would reinforce the sagging ridge beam from below. He cut a double prop, notched both ends, and set them under the beam where it had begun to bow, driving the feet into holes he dug and then packed tight with rock and tamped earth. The roof stopped being a bowl. It became, again, a roof. For chinking, he used a combination of methods. Between the lowest courses of logs, where cold air pooled and ran like invisible water, he pressed dried moss collected from the north faces of the streamside stones, packing it in with a flat stick until the gaps were sealed solid. Higher up, where the wall faced south and dried quickly, he mixed river clay with dry grass and pressed that into the cracks, smoothing the surface flush with the logs. He tested each section by holding a candle flame near the wall on the windiest afternoons and watching for flicker. The flame told him the truth. The door he rehung on both hinges using iron strap he found in the debris beneath the shack. The previous occupant had apparently once intended improvements, and planed the swollen bottom edge with a draw knife borrowed from a rancher named Cobb, who lived 2 miles down the track, and who had, upon discovering that the old Fitch shack had acquired an occupant, ridden up to assess the situation with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. Cobb was 60, weathered the way fence posts are weathered, and he surveyed the work Jonah had done with an expression that moved slowly from skepticism to something approaching interest. "Chimney draws?" he said. "Draws clean," Jonah said. Cobb nodded once, dismounted, walked around the building twice, and said nothing more about it. He lent the draw knife without being asked a second time. The window frames Jonah covered with oilskin he purchased on his sole trip into Alder Ridge, which cost him 60 cents and a walk of 4 miles each direction. In town, he was observed by several people and assessed, as strangers were, with the frank economy of small communities. He heard the word drifter twice, once from a woman in front of the dry goods store, and once from a boy who was perhaps 12 and had not yet learned discretion. He bought his oilskin, 2 pounds of salt, a paper of needles, and a spool of heavy thread, and he walked the 4 miles back. By the end of September, the shack held heat. It held it the way a good coat holds heat, not by keeping the cold out entirely, but by giving warmth somewhere reliable to stay. He lived in it alone and worked on it daily and told no one what he intended, because he did not yet know himself. The letter arrived the second week of October, tucked into the saddlebag of a rider named Pell, who came up the track delivering mail along the ridge on behalf of the Alder Ridge postmaster. Pell was a lean young man with an indifferent mustache who seemed surprised to find the shack occupied and further surprised to find it presentable. The letter was not addressed to Jonah. It was addressed to Aldous Fitch at the property now owned by Jonah Creel, and it had been forwarded from Fitch's ranch house by Fitch's wife, who had added a penciled note on the outside that read, "Belongs to the man at the shack now, I suppose." Jonah opened it because it had his address, more or less. It was from the Territorial Land Office in Boise. It informed whoever held the property that the track running along the ridge, the rut Jonah thought of as the road, was a designated emergency passage route, and that any structure within 40 yards of the track center line was subject to territorial inspection for habitability standards in the event of a declared emergency condition, specifically in relation to the provision of shelter for stranded travelers during severe weather events. Jonah read it twice. The language was dense and official and smelled of bureaucrats who had never spent a night on the open range. Then he read the practical sentence buried in the 3rd paragraph. Structures found to provide adequate shelter, heat, and fresh water access may be formally registered as emergency waypoints, entitling the owner to a quarterly stipend from the Territorial Relief Fund, not to exceed $4 per quarter. $4 a quarter was not wealth, but it was recognition of a kind, and it came with an implication that settled into Jonah's thinking like a stone into still water. People might need this place. The territory itself was suggesting it. He folded the letter and put it in the coffee tin where he kept important things, and he went back to work. He did not act on the letter immediately. He thought about it the way he thought about most things, while doing something else, while his hands were occupied and his conscious mind had nothing to grip. The problem was the word adequate. Adequate for whom? A trail cowboy's adequate was a lean-to and a fire. A family's adequate was something else. A woman traveling with children in a mountain snowstorm. What did she need that this shack currently could or could not provide? He walked the interior measurements with his boot heel. 12 feet by 16. Room for a fire. Room for 4 or 5 people to sit without pressing against each other. Barely room for 6. The roof was now sound. The walls held heat. The floor was dirt, which was cold. He had one kettle, one skillet, and a collection of tin cups he had accumulated over decades of trail life, each one dented in its own particular way. He had no beds, no blankets beyond his own 2, no stores of food sufficient for guests. He sat with these facts for several days and came to understand that the debate he was having with himself was not really about supplies. Supplies could be acquired, slowly, as money permitted. The debate was about something that had lived in him unexamined for years, the way a splinter lives in a hand. Present, low-grade, accommodated. The question was whether he wanted anyone to need him. He had spent 31 years working for other men's outfits. He had been useful in the specific, bounded way that a skilled hand is useful. His rope, his horse sense, his ability to read weather and terrain and cattle behavior. He had been respected for these things in the narrow context of the work. Outside that context, he had been invisible, which suited him adequately, he had always told himself. But there had been a morning in Wyoming, 8 years back, when a young rider named Dewey Marsh had gotten turned around in a spring blizzard, and Jonah had found him by sound alone. The boy's horse had been making a particular distressed noise that Jonah recognized through 40 yards of white, and brought him in. Dewey had been barely conscious and had gripped Jonah's arm with both hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. That had been something. Jonah had not examined it closely afterward, because examining it closely felt dangerous in a way he couldn't precisely name. But it had been something. The grip of those hands. He was 46 years old now. He sometimes lost track of the number, which told him something about how little it had mattered to him. He was not a young man. He had no family, no partner, no claim on anyone's future. He had a shack beside a stream in Idaho Territory, and $41 he'd arrived with minus 60 cents for oilskin and supplies, plus the 20 cents Cobb had pressed on him for the use of the draw knife, which Jonah had tried to refuse and which Cobb had left on the windowsill anyway. The shack was his. He had made it something from nothing, or nearly nothing, which was a thing he understood how to do. The resistance to registering it as a waypoint was not, he finally understood, practical. It was habitual. He had organized his life around not mattering to anyone, and that habit had become so comfortable that it felt, from inside it, like preference. Cobb came by again in late October with a question about whether Jonah had seen cattle on the upper track. He hadn't, and stayed for coffee and said, while looking at the new oilskin windows and the restacked woodpile under the fir trees, "You're putting real work into this place." "It needed it," Jonah said. "Most men would have sold the timber and moved on." Jonah poured coffee and did not respond immediately. Then he said, "Most men had somewhere to move on to." Cobb considered this with the respect he gave to all honest statements. "What are you going to do with it then, when it's done?" Jonah said, "I'm going to live in it." "And?" "I'm thinking about and?" Cobb drank his coffee and looked out the south-facing window at the valley, where the first dustings of early snow had appeared on the upper ridges like preliminary signatures. "Winter comes early up here some years," he said. "Road gets bad fast. I've seen men caught on that track in November weather that had no business being caught." "I know," Jonah said. "Place like this, if it was known, if people knew it was here and that there was heat, it'd be worth knowing about." Jonah looked at him. Cobb set his cup down and stood and pulled his coat on without elaboration. At the door, he paused and said, "I'm not telling you your business. I'm telling you the weather." He left. Jonah stood in the center of the shack and looked at the fire, which was doing exactly what a fire is supposed to do, and felt the heat the stone chimney was putting into the room, and thought about the grip of Dewey Marsh's hands. He got the letter from the coffee tin. He read it a third time. He went to the small shelf he'd built beside the chimney where he kept paper and the stub of a pencil, and he sat down on his bedroll and began composing a reply to the Territorial Land Office. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied, each draft shorter than the last, until the final version said only, "The property at the Fitchline Shack, now Creel, is prepared to serve as an emergency waypoint. Heat, water, and shelter are available. Jonah Creel, proprietor." He sealed it in an envelope and put it on the windowsill for Pell. In the morning, it was gone. Pell came back 11 days later with a stamped document from the Territorial Land Office confirming the registration of the Creel Waypoint, as they had designated it, on the emergency passage register for the eastern slope of the Boise Range. It was signed by a deputy clerk whose name Jonah couldn't read, and stamped with a seal that had been applied slightly sideways, which gave the whole document a cheerful informality. He tacked it to the inside of the door. Then he went to work in earnest. Not on the structure. The structure was sound. What he worked on now was the question of capacity. If people were coming, they needed more than warmth. He split and stacked 4 additional cords of wood against the south face of the fir stand, which took him a week of sustained labor and left his arms the particular numb, heavy feeling of work properly done. He built a second sleeping shelf along the east wall from salvaged timber. A simple plank affair, 6 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, 4 inches off the ground, which could serve as a bench or a bed. He stitched together 2 additional blankets from burlap and the wool of a cast-off saddle blanket Cobb produced without comment. He laid in salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, and 2 pounds of coffee. He acquired, from a peddler who came through in late October, a second kettle. He told himself he was being practical. He told himself that a waypoint needed to be functional, not personal, and that none of this meant anything beyond sensible preparation for a registered responsibility. He told himself this, and he stacked another cord of wood and believed about half of it. A different kind of change arrived on horseback on a Wednesday in early November, in the form of a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who was 42 years old, ran the small schoolhouse in Alder Ridge, and had a habit of riding the ridge track on clear afternoons because, as she explained to Jonah without preamble when she stopped at his shack, she found the view of the valley useful for thinking. "Thinking about what?" Jonah said, because he was a man who asked the actual question. "About whatever wants thinking about," she said. She was looking at the chimney. "That draws well." "It does." "You chinked those walls yourself?" "I did." She dismounted and walked once around the shack in the careful, assessing way that reminded him unexpectedly of Cobb, and then said, "I heard you registered as a waypoint." "I did." "That was a good idea." "The Territory seemed to think so." "I'm not talking about the Territory," she said, and remounted, and rode on down the track toward the valley. She came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. She brought, on the 3rd visit, a small crate that held 4 books, a folded piece of oilcloth, and a bag of dried apples, which she left on the woodpile without explanation. Jonah brought them inside. He read one of the books that evening. It was about rivers. He thought about that, about a woman who brought books about rivers to a man who lived beside a stream. The first real test of the waypoint came before December. A freighter named Ollie Strand got caught on the ridge track on a November afternoon when the weather turned without warning, the particular kind of turn the mountains make when they've been waiting for permission and suddenly stop waiting. 1 hour the sky was high and pale and reasonable. The next it was the color of a Dutch oven and moving fast. Strand saw the shack from the track and made for it with the directness of a man who has survived long enough to recognize a decision point. He knocked on the door, knocked as if it were a hotel, and Jonah opened it and looked at him and said, "Come in." Strand was large, red-faced, and pulling a freight wagon loaded with iron goods for a ranch on the far side of the ridge. The wagon wasn't going any farther that night. The horses, 2 big roans, needed to be seen to. "Tie them in the trees," Jonah said. "There's a natural windbreak behind the fir stand. Enough grass still under the snow on the south side of the trunk line." Strand looked at him as if evaluating whether this advice came from someone worth listening to. "I've had a mule back there for 2 weeks, Jonah said. He had acquired the mule from Cobb in trade for a week of fence work, a different transaction than the draw knife, a larger one. Strand went and tended his horses and came back stamping snow off his boots on the flat stone Jonah had set as a threshold, and sat down by the fire and accepted coffee, and began to describe his situation with the detailed thoroughness of a man who had been frightened and needed to speak it out of his body. Jonah listened. He was a good listener in the way that people who have spent decades in their own company tend to be, fully attentive, without the anxious need to fill pauses. The storm ran through the night. By morning it had dropped 8 inches, and the track was passable but deeply drifted in the low cuts. Strand ate salt pork and cornmeal mush at the fire, declared it the best meal he'd eaten in a month, which Jonah suspected was hyperbole, but received without comment, and went on his way before noon. He left $2 on the shelf beside the chimney. Jonah looked at it for a long time before he picked it up. December arrived with the purposeful severity of a creditor who has been patient long enough. The first week brought 3 separate snowstorms in 8 days, each one piling its contribution on the last until the ridge track was a white corridor between walls of drifted snow that the wind sculpted into shapes that would have been beautiful if they weren't also dangerous. Jonah packed the track each morning with the mule, walking it back and forth over the worst drifts to compress them into something manageable, which was not required of him as a waypoint proprietor, but which seemed, given the circumstances, like the obvious right thing to do. He had 4 visitors in that first week. The first 2 came together, brothers named Walt and Seamus Greer, ranch hands from the Halverson outfit 6 miles north, who had been sent with a wagon to collect barbed wire from a depot in Alder Ridge, and had gotten the timing wrong in the casual way that people who have not spent enough winters in the mountains get timing wrong. They arrived at the shack as the second storm was beginning, argued briefly on the threshold about whether to push on. Walt was for pushing on, Seamus was against it, and were settled by Jonah's quiet observation that the temperature was dropping faster than the snowfall, which meant ice under the new snow, which meant the horses would be down before they made the first cut. They came inside. They ate dried beans with salt pork. They slept on the floor, which was the dirt floor, and did not complain about it, and left in the morning with handshakes and the slightly dazed quality of men who had expected worse. The third visitor was a traveling dentist named Dr. Archibald Munn, who came through on the 3rd day of December in a small painted wagon that advertised his services on its side panel. Dr. Munn was 61 years old, had an umbrella for reasons he didn't explain, and was deeply philosophically opposed to the weather. "I have been practicing dentistry in this territory for 23 years, he said, accepting coffee and settling into the posture of a man who intends to be warm for some time. "And every winter I say I'll go south, and every winter something keeps me. This year it was a woman in Prairie City who needed a bridge, and now look at me." "The bridge worked out?" Jonah said. "Beautifully," said Dr. Munn. "She cried when she could chew again. That's why I stay." He was a talker, which Jonah found not unpleasant after the sustained quiet of recent weeks. Dr. Munn had opinions about dentistry, about the territorial legislature, about the price of tin, about whether the railroad would come through as promised and whether it would help or simply change the nature of the problems. He told 2 stories about extraordinary teeth he had encountered and one about a bear, and then fell asleep in his chair by the fire with the abrupt, uncomplicated quality of a man with a clear conscience. In the morning he left and came back 20 minutes later with a bag of hard candy from his wagon, which he set on the shelf with the gravity of a significant gift. "For children," he said, "in case you get them." He drove away into a sky that was holding its weather in reserve and looked, for the moment, merely threatening rather than actively hostile. The 4th visitor that week was Cobb, who came not because he was stranded, but because he wanted to see how the waypoint was functioning, and who sat for an hour drinking coffee and saying very little and looking at everything with the slow, comprehensive attention of an old man who has learned that observation is a form of respect. "Strand told people in town," Cobb said finally. "What did he tell them?" "That the shack on the ridge is real, that there's heat and food and someone who knows what they're doing." Cobb turned his cup in his hands. He said it like it was news. "It's not news," Jonah said. "It is to the people who drove past it for 5 years without stopping." Cobb set the cup down. "Walt Greer told the Halverson foreman. Foreman told the men. Dr. Munn will tell everyone in the next 3 settlements he visits, because that's what Dr. Munn does. Jonah looked at the fire. You're going to have more visitors, Cobb said. Before winter's out, you're going to have a lot more visitors. The stores will need to be deeper, Jonah said. Yes. I'll need more blankets. I have blankets, Cobb said. And I have a neighbor, Hattie Briggs, who quilts. I'll speak to her. They sat with this for a moment, the quiet that attends a plan being recognized as real. Agnes Pruitt came by, Jonah said. It was not what he meant to say. He had not intended to say it at all. Cobb's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. She comes on Wednesdays, he said, as if this were general knowledge. She brought books, Jonah said. Agnes brings what she thinks is needed, Cobb said. She has a good sense of what's needed. He stood and buttoned his coat. She also has a good sense of people. Always has. He left. Jonah sat for a while longer and thought about that, and then went to split more wood, which was always, in his experience, the correct response to having too many thoughts at once. Agnes came on the following Wednesday, as she had established was her custom, and brought with her not only the usual quiet willingness to assess and observe, but also a woman named Ruth Haskell, who was 38 years old, taught arithmetic in the same schoolhouse where Agnes taught reading, and had, Agnes mentioned as they dismounted, a great deal of practical sense. Ruth Haskell looked at the shack with the expression of someone updating an expectation. I thought it would be smaller, she said. Most people think it would be worse, Jonah said. Most people assume the worst about things they haven't bothered to look at, she said, in a tone that suggested she had made peace with this aspect of people without approving of it. She walked inside. She looked at the sleeping shelves, the chimney, the stacked supplies on the back wall, the second kettle, the tin cups arranged on their hook with the neatness that comes from a life of keeping things in known places. She looked at the candy Dr. Munn had left, which Jonah had not eaten. You're expecting children, she said. Dentist left it, said in case. Ruth turned and looked at him with a directness that he found, unexpectedly, comfortable rather than unnerving. Have you ever had children stay here? Not yet, Jonah said. You will, Ruth said, and you'll need more than candy. Ruth Haskell was not the kind of woman who identified a problem without also identifying a solution. Within the week, she had sent Pell up the track with a bundle that contained 2 wool blankets sized for children, a cloth bag of dried apple rings, and a folded paper on which she had written, in a schoolteacher's clear hand, a list of suggested additions to the Waypoint stores. The list was thorough and unsentimental and ended with a hook on the wall near the door for wet coats. Children always leave them on the floor. Jonah read the list twice, went into town for the first time in 6 weeks, and bought what he could afford. He added the hook near the door himself, from a bent nail set deep in the doorframe timber. Agnes came the following Wednesday and noted the hook without comment. She brought dried venison and a paper of pins, and she brought, more unexpectedly, a question. Why did you do all this? She said. She was sitting on the sleeping shelf, which doubled as the seating when there was no emergency, with her coat across her lap and her hands folded over it. The shack, the Waypoint, all of it. Jonah was at the fire, turning the venison on the skillet. He took his time answering because he took his time with everything, and because the question deserved it. I had a place, he said. I was going to make it useful. That's the what, Agnes said, not the why. He turned the venison. I found a boy in a blizzard once, he said finally. Wyoming. He held on with both hands. He paused. I thought about that for 8 years and didn't know what to do with it. This, he gestured briefly at the walls, the fire, the hook by the door. This is what to do with it. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Did you know him? The boy? Not before, afterwards some. And after? He went on, joined an outfit in Montana. Jonah turned the venison again. I hope he's warm. Agnes said, that's the why, and let it settle there between them without adding to it, which was, Jonah thought, one of the things he had come to value about her Wednesdays. She knew the weight of what she said and didn't pile more on top. She stayed through the afternoon. She helped him inventory the stores and suggested a system for the tin cups, stacked by size, smallest inside largest, that made better use of the shelf. She told him about a family on the eastern track, the Holloways, who had 3 children and an uncertain wagon and a habit of traveling in weather that made their neighbors anxious. She told him this the way she told him everything, without urgency, as information that might be useful. "They'll come through eventually," she said. "They always make the Alder Ridge run in December for supplies." "I'll be here," Jonah said. "I know," she said, in a tone that was not simple, and left before the light went. He sat that evening longer than usual at the fire and thought about the things that had accumulated in the shack since September. The supplies, the blankets, the hook, the candy, the books about rivers. The way Cobb came and stayed and said little but clearly found the place worth returning to. The way Ruth Haskell had sent a list not because anyone asked her to, but because she had seen what was needed and was constitutionally unable not to respond. He had organized his life around not mattering to anyone. He had done it so thoroughly for so long that he had confused the organization with the desire. He was not sure, sitting at the fire in the shack he had made from nothing with his own hands and the particular stubbornness of a man who had nowhere else to be, that the desire had ever actually been there. He thought he might have been hiding. He thought the shack might be the place he'd built to stop. The Holloways arrived on December 14th, which Jonah knew because he had begun keeping a small calendar on the wall near the chimney, marking the days with a pencil stroke, a habit he'd never had before but which had crept up on him as the shack became a place where time was accounted for. They arrived at dusk, which was early in December, with a wagon that listed slightly to the right and a horse that was blowing harder than it should have been, and 3 children arranged in the wagon bed among the supply sacks, like packages that had been given hats. The father, Emmett Holloway, was 35 and thin, and handled the reins with the mechanical competence of someone who has been doing a thing so long that it no longer requires thought. His wife, Della, sat beside him and had the particular alertness of a person who was doing all the thinking for 2. Jonah had the door open before they reached the threshold. Della assessed the shack's interior in the approximately 4 seconds it took her to step through the door, and her assessment produced a single visible reaction. Her shoulders went down. Jonah recognized this. He had watched it happen with Strand and with the Greer brothers and with Dr. Munn. The shoulders went down when a person understood that they were safe. The 3 children tumbled in. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 10 named Bess, who immediately went to the sleeping shelf and sat on it and looked around with the frank curiosity of a child who is not afraid. The middle was a boy of 7 named Holt, who discovered the tin cups and made a preliminary investigation of each one. The youngest was a girl of 4 named Pearl, who stood very still in the center of the room and stared at the fire. "It's all right," Jonah said to Pearl. She continued to stare at the fire. Then she said, "It's pretty." "It is," Jonah agreed. Emmett came in from settling the horse and took his hat off and looked at the room and said, "I heard about this place from Halverson's man. Didn't quite believe it." "It's here," Jonah said. "So I see." The evening was the most complicated the Waypoint had yet managed. 5 people plus Jonah in the 12-by-16 space, and the fire going well and the kettle on, and Jonah cooking dried beans with the last of the salt pork, and a handful of dried sage that Dr. Munn had left along with the candy, having apparently decided the shelf was a community larder. The children were fed first, which was Della's iron rule and which Jonah had anticipated. He had the candy out and the cups ready and a proportion of bean stew set aside before he mentioned any of it. Bess found the books Agnes had left and read to Holt from the one about rivers. Pearl fell asleep against Della's side with the completeness that small children have, all weight surrendered, trusting entirely. Emmett said after supper, in a voice set low so the children wouldn't hear, "The Ridge Road. How bad does it get?" "By January," Jonah said, "the drifts in the low cuts can be 10 feet. The track's passable in a thaw, impassable in a blow." Emmett nodded slowly. "We cut it close this year." "You did," Jonah said without judgment. "We won't next year." Emmett looked at his hands. I don't always— He stopped, started again. I'm better with cattle than I am with plans. Most men are, Jonah said. Emmett looked at him with the sharp attention of someone recognizing something. You're not. I used to be. I learned plans late. Jonah looked at the fire. You can learn them. It was, for Jonah, an unusually long speech on a personal subject. He was surprised to find he didn't regret it. In the morning the sky had cleared to the particular hard blue of a cold snap, which was beautiful and meant the road would be frozen fast and manageable. Emmett looked at the sky and declared they could make the last 8 miles to their property before noon. He shook Jonah's hand with both of his, which was the dewy marsh grip, the grip Jonah had spent 8 years carrying, and said, I'll tell people. Cobb will tell people, Jonah said. I'll tell them louder, Emmett said. Della was last out. She had, while Jonah's back was turned, done something efficient with the blankets on the sleeping shelf, refolded them in a tighter arrangement that would hold better and take up less space. She had also, Jonah noticed, washed the cups in a basin of water from the stream and left them upturned to dry. She stood in the doorway and looked back at the shack with the expression of someone filing a place carefully in memory. The children will talk about this their whole lives, she said. The warm shack on the ridge. That'll be a thing they remember. Jonah said, Good. I mean it as a kindness, she said. I took it as one, he said. She went. The wagon moved down the track toward the valley, smaller and smaller, and then the firs closed behind it, and it was gone. The shack was very quiet. Jonah stood in the center of it and listened to the quiet and found that it had changed. It was not empty quiet anymore. It was the quiet of a place that had been full. Word traveled the way. Word travels in country where people depend on each other for information the way they depend on each other for fence repair. Seriously, reliably, with a sense of mutual obligation. By the 3rd week of December, Jonah had hosted 11 visitors in as many days. He had hosted a pair of surveyors from the Territorial Land Commission who were deeply grateful and embarrassingly formal, and left a hand-drawn map of the ridge track pinned above the door. He had hosted a widow named Cecily Marsh, no relation to Dewey as far as either of them knew, who was moving her household goods to a daughter's place in Alder Ridge, and who spent her night in the shack organizing Jonah's supply shelf into a system she described as logical and which he privately agreed was superior to his own. He had hosted a minister named Rahl, who said grace over cornmeal mush with the sincerity of a man for whom gratitude was not a formality, and who left a testament on the shelf without comment. Agnes came on her Wednesday and found the testament and raised an eyebrow. Minister, Jonah said. He comes through every December, she said. He's reliable in exactly the way the weather isn't. She sat on the sleeping shelf and looked at the map the surveyors had left. This is good, she said. People can see where they are. That was the idea, Jonah said. She looked at him then with something that was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but occupied the useful territory between them. Agnes, Jonah said. Jonah, you've come every Wednesday. I have. In any weather. The cold doesn't bother me as much as people think it should. She was looking at her hands now, not at him. I like it here. It's honest. The walls are honest. The fire is honest. You're— She stopped. I'm what? He said. You're the most straightforwardly honest person I've met in 20 years of living on this ridge, she said, with the clarity of someone who has chosen their words very carefully and is done revising. I find it restful. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the track. Jonah did not say anything, but something in him that had been held carefully against the cold for a very long time, longer perhaps than the shack had been in its disrepair, shifted toward the heat. Christmas Eve arrived with a silence so deep it was almost visible, the particular stillness that comes when the temperature drops 20 degrees in an afternoon and the world holds its breath. Jonah had more in the shack than he'd ever had in any space he'd inhabited. 3 cords of split wood stacked and dry, a full store of dried beans and salt pork and cornmeal and coffee, 6 blankets from Hattie Briggs, plus his own 2, a second sleeping shelf he'd built on the east wall, the candy, the testament, the surveyor's map, the books about rivers, the hook by the door, the cups nested by size. He sat by the fire and counted not the things, but the visits. He had, in 3 months, helped 23 people get through bad weather. He had fed all of them. He had, in some cases, simply given them a place to sit and be warm until the fear went out of their shoulders. He was not the thing people drove past anymore. He was not sure exactly when that had changed. It had not changed at once. It had changed the way the walls had changed. Press by press, layer by layer, each small addition sealing another gap until the wind found no purchase. Agnes would come in the morning. She had said so the previous Wednesday, specifically, "I'll come Christmas morning if you'll have me." And he had said yes in the plain, complete way that he said all the things he meant. He stoked the fire and looked at the room he had made. He thought, this is what the work was for. All of it. Every pressed layer of moss, every planed edge. This. January arrived like a creditor who had sent December as a preliminary warning. The temperature on the 1st of January fell to 12 below, which Jonah measured not by thermometer, he had none, but by the behavior of the stream, which stopped moving, and the fire, which needed feeding every 2 hours through the night, and the mule, which pressed against the windbreak behind the fur stand with the solid resignation of an animal accustomed to patience, but aware that patience had a floor. It was in this weather, on January 3rd, that Jonah became aware of a different kind of problem. Pell came up the track in the late morning, moving faster than his usual deliberate pace, and knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was unlike him. He was carrying the mailbag, and an expression that said the mailbag was not the point of the visit. "There's a letter from the land office," Pell said, opening the bag and finding it. "And there's talk in town I thought you should know about before you read it." Jonah took the letter. He did not open it yet. "What kind of talk?" "Aldous Fitch kind of talk." Pell sat down without being invited, which was also unlike him. "Fitch is saying that when he sold you the property, he didn't know it would be used commercially. He's saying the Waypoint stipend makes it a commercial operation, which changes the terms he says he would have agreed to. He's been to the land office in Boise about it." Jonah looked at the envelope. "His lawyer," Pell continued, "sent a letter to the land office arguing that the original sale should be reviewed because the buyer, that's you, had an undisclosed commercial intent when he negotiated the sale price." "I had $40 and nowhere to go," Jonah said. "I know that," Pell said. "The lawyer apparently argues different." Jonah opened the letter. It was from the Territorial Land Office, signed by a different clerk than the first letter, and it was considerably longer than the registration confirmation had been. It informed him that a formal review of the Waypoint's registration status had been initiated following a complaint filed by Aldous Fitch, that the review would consider whether the property had been obtained through fair dealing, and that the quarterly stipend was suspended pending resolution of the review. Additionally, and this was the paragraph that Jonah read 3 times, the letter stated that if the review found the original sale had been conducted improperly, the land office retained the authority to invalidate the sale and return the property to its previous owner. Jonah folded the letter and put it on the shelf. "I'm sorry," Pell said. "You didn't do it," Jonah said. "No." Pell stood. "Fitch did. He's been telling people in town that he sold too low because you presented yourself as a simple drifter with no plans, that you took advantage." Jonah was quiet for a moment. He thought about the Tuesday in September when Fitch had shaken his hand with visible pity. He thought about $40, which was everything he had, traded for a building that generous people called a line shack. He thought about the word drifter said by a woman in front of the dry goods store, and a boy who had not learned discretion. "What's Fitch want?" Jonah said. "The property back at the original price if the review goes his way." "And it might," Pell said quietly. "He's got a lawyer and you've got a coffee tin." After Pell left, Jonah sat with the letter and thought about what was actually at stake. The stipend didn't matter. $4 a quarter was a symbol, not a livelihood. What mattered was the property. If the sale was invalidated, he lost the shack. And if he lost the shack, he lost not just a building, but the 23 people who had come through it, the 23 shoulder drops he had watched when people understood they were safe. He lost the hook by the door, and the cups nested by size, and the shelf Widow Marsh had organized in Dr. Munn's candy and the books about rivers and the thing he had spent the whole autumn building that was not, he now understood, a building at all. He got his paper and pencil and began to write down, from memory, everything he had done to the property and everything it had cost him, because the facts were what he had, and facts were what could be organized and presented, even from a coffee tin. He wrote for 2 hours. When he was done, he had a list that covered both sides of 3 sheets of paper. He read it over. It was a full account. Every piece of timber, every pound of supplies, every visitor, every night he had kept fire through. He had improved the property by a value that was difficult to measure precisely and impossible to dismiss. He folded the pages into the coffee tin with the original registration letter. Then he went out to split more wood because the temperature was still dropping and the fire needed feeding, and whatever Fitch was doing in Boise, the cold was real and immediate, and the people who would come up the track tonight or tomorrow or the week after that needed warmth, and he intended to provide it, review or no review. He split wood until his arms ached and the stack was twice what it had been. The review process, as it turned out, moved at the pace of territorial bureaucracy, which is to say it moved like a river in January, not stopped entirely, but so slow the motion was imperceptible from any single vantage point. Meanwhile, Fitch began telling his version of events to everyone within range, and Fitch was a man with range. He ran cattle on the upper meadows, which meant he had dealings with every rancher and feed merchant and hand on the east slope. He was not a dishonest man in the common meaning of that word. He genuinely believed that he had been disadvantaged by the sale, in the way that people can genuinely believe things that are convenient to believe. He told his story with the confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned. The version of the story that circulated in Alder Ridge, filtered through the selective attention of gossip, was that a drifter with no legitimate claim had gotten a property for almost nothing on false pretenses, and was now running a lodging operation on the public road. Jonah heard this version through Cobb, who delivered it in his flat, factual way, without editorializing, because Cobb believed that a man deserved to know what was being said about him. Lodging operation, Jonah repeated. That's the phrase, Cobb said. I've charged 3 people ever. 2 of them left money without being asked. I know that, Cobb said. Fitch's lawyer knows a different version. What complicated matters further was that the review, in its bureaucratic thoroughness, had sent a letter to every person listed on the Waypoint Register requesting statements about the nature of their visit and what they had paid. Jonah had not kept a register in the formal sense. The land office had created one from Pell's delivery records and the initial registration document. The letter that went out was vague and official and frightened some people, not because they had done anything wrong, but because official letters from the Territorial Land Office had an authority that made even innocent recipients feel implicated. Walt Greer came to the shack on a Thursday, not his usual day for anything, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, I got a letter. I know, Jonah said. Come in. I don't want to cause you trouble, Walt said. My brother says just don't respond, and maybe it goes away. It won't go away, Jonah said. The review is real. What you write back will be read. What should I write? Jonah looked at him. Write what happened. You came in a storm. There was heat. You ate supper and slept on the floor and left in the morning. That's the whole of it. That's it? That's the whole of it, Jonah said. The truth is the simplest version. Walt looked relieved in the way of someone who had been braced for complexity and found plain ground instead. He came in for coffee and left with his hat on properly. Agnes came that Wednesday, and her expression when she arrived was the one she wore when she had been thinking hard about something for several days and had arrived at a conclusion she was prepared to defend. I wrote to the land office, she said, sitting down with her coat still on. Jonah looked at her. I didn't ask you to. I'm aware of that. What did you write? I wrote that I have visited this waypoint every week since November, and that I have observed it to be operated with complete integrity, that the proprietor has charged nothing for the provision of heat and shelter, that the improvement to the property represents a significant investment of labor and materials, and that the registration of this waypoint has demonstrably served the public good on at least 23 documented occasions. She said this steadily, as if reading from a prepared text, which she essentially was. She told him, written several drafts. I also wrote that I am a schoolteacher in Alder Ridge with 20 years of standing in this community, and that my assessment of people's character is reasonably informed.
Jonah sat for a moment. Ruth wrote as well, Agnes said, and Dr. Munn, who I tracked down through Pell, is at present in Fort Boise, which is convenient for the land office. He has already delivered his statement in person. She finally unbuttoned her coat. And Emmett Holloway wrote a letter that I understand was 3 pages long and fairly strong in its language. I thought he said he wasn't a plansman, Jonah said. He said he was better with cattle than plans. Letters apparently are different. Agnes looked at the fire. You're not alone in this, Jonah. This place matters to people. Jonah looked at the walls he had built, at the chinking he had pressed in layer by layer in September, the clay and moss, the careful, patient work of making gaps into seals. I know that, he said. Now. Did you not know it before? He thought about it honestly. I knew it like I knew the chimney drew, something I could demonstrate but not quite feel. He paused. I feel it now. Agnes looked at him for a moment, and then away, and the fire between them put its warmth out steadily into the room, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and neither of them needed to. The review board scheduled an in-person assessment for the 22nd of January, which meant a territorial inspector would come up the ridge track and evaluate the property and the circumstances of its registration. This was, Cobb explained when he heard, both a good thing and a complicated thing. Good because they're coming here, he said. Inspector can see the work you've done. Complicated because if the weather turns, it gets postponed, and postponement tends to favor the lawyer with the filed paperwork over the man with the coffee tin. Jonah understood this. He also understood that he could not control the weather, which meant he should concentrate on what he could control, which was the shack itself. He went over every inch of it the week before the assessment. He rechecked the chimney, running his hand along the exterior stones where clay had a tendency to contract in deep cold, pressing any loosened sections back with fresh clay he thawed by the fire. He examined the roof from outside with a long pole, testing the snow load on the ridge beam. The beam held. His reinforcement in October had done its job. He planed a rough edge on the east sleeping shelf that had developed a splinter. He replaced 2 of the oilskin window coverings that had grown brittle in the cold and were allowing hair-fine drafts. He did not do these things for the inspector. He did them because the shack required them, and because he had not yet encountered a problem with keeping his work current. 3 visitors came through in the week before the assessment, which meant the waypoint was functioning during the inspector's approach period, and there would be recent evidence of use. The first was a young couple, newly married and spectacularly unprepared for mountain winter travel, who arrived on horseback in the early evening of January 18th, looking like people who had recently revised their opinion of adventure. They were grateful, with the wholehearted gratitude of the recently frightened, and they ate everything put in front of them, and slept on both sleeping shelves, and left in the morning with the particular brightness of people who have been spared a consequence, and know it. The second was a freighter Jonah didn't know, who said almost nothing, ate salt pork and beans with methodical appreciation, slept 4 hours, and continued before dawn. The third was Pell, who came not with mail but with news. Fitch's lawyer had submitted an additional filing arguing that the improvements Jonah had made were made on property not legally his, and therefore reverted to Fitch in the event of a sale invalidation. The improvements. The chimney work, the timber and the labor and the oilskin windows and the sleeping shelves. Everything.
He went to the window after Pell left and looked at the South Valley through the oilskin. The valley gone pale and flat in the January light, the ridge curving away to the east and west like arms that might offer protection or might simply be geography, depending on the day. The improvements. He had given most of 4 months to the shack. He had given his hands, calluses over calluses, the particular map of a man's labor written in his palms. He had given the $40 that was everything, and the 60 cents that left him with a single dollar and his own sufficiency in exchange for a ruin that he had, by patient and methodical work, made into a thing of value. Fitch's lawyer was now suggesting that the making belonged to the prior owner because the making had occurred on disputed ground. Jonah turned this over carefully, the way he turned over all problems, without heat, in the deliberate manner of a man who has learned that heat distorts the shape of things. The legal argument, as he understood it, was not entirely without structure. He was not a lawyer. He did not know the relevant territory statutes by chapter and verse. What he knew was what he had done, and when he had done it, and why. And he had written that down, and the coffee tin held it. He also knew something the lawyer's argument did not account for. 23 people had come through the cold and been warm, and they knew why, and they had said so in letters to the land office that were now part of the formal record. The law handled property. The record handled people. He didn't know which one the inspector would weigh more heavily. He suspected it would depend on the inspector. He went to the shelf and took down Agnes's books, the ones about rivers, the others she had added over the weeks, a natural history of the Great Basin, a slim collection of survey poetry from the Territorial Press. He hadn't read them all. He had read parts of each one, the way you do when time is limited and the lamp oil needs minding. He picked up the river book and read 2 pages by firelight, because the assessment was 2 days away and there was nothing more he could do to prepare, and reading settled him in the same way splitting wood settled him. It gave his mind somewhere specific to stand. Outside, the temperature held at 8 below. The fire held its heat in the stone. He turned the page. The inspector arrived on the morning of January 22nd with the ridge track frozen iron hard and the sky overhead the brittle, absolute blue that only very cold, clear days produce. His name was Harlan Cross, and he was 55, compact, and traveled alone on a dark bay horse with the ease of a man who has spent his career covering territory by horseback and found it agreeable. He dismounted at the shack and looked at it for a long time before knocking, which Jonah observed from the window and took as a sign of a thorough man. Jonah opened the door before the second knock. Cross came inside and stood in the center of the room in the posture of professional assessment. Not quite relaxed, not quite stiff, the balanced stance of someone accumulating information. He looked at the chimney, the walls, the sleeping shelves, the stacked stores, the window coverings, the hook by the door with 2 coats hanging from it. "You did this work yourself," he said. It was not a question. Most of it. Cobb down the track lent a draw knife in October. Cross walked to the near wall and pressed his palm against the chinking between the 3rd and 4th log course. He walked to the chimney and looked up into the flue and then down at the firebox and the stone apron. He examined the reinforced ridge beam by going outside and looking at the roofline from 3 angles, which meant standing in 12 below air with the consideration of a man who would not be hurried. He came back inside and sat on the sleeping shelf and took out a notebook. "Tell me about the 23 visits," he said. Jonah told him. He told it plainly, in order from strand forward, describing each visit the way he would describe a count of cattle, accurately, without embellishment, with specific detail where detail was relevant. When he finished, Cross had filled 4 pages. "The statements from Agnes Pruitt and Ruth Haskell and Emmett Holloway," Cross said. "You didn't ask for those." "No. People wrote them without being asked, as far as I know." Cross looked at the hook by the door. "Dr. Munn told me in person, in Boise, that the candy was for children, in case you get them." He paused. He said it twice. "He seemed to think it was important," Jonah said. Cross wrote something in his notebook. Then he closed it. "I've seen a lot of registered waypoints," he said. "Most of them are a lean-to and a prayer." Cross left before noon, saying only that the review board would consider all submitted materials and issue a finding within 30 days. His expression, which had been professional throughout, told Jonah nothing certain. After his horse disappeared around the fur stand, Jonah sat down on the sleeping shelf and was very still for some time. The uncertainty was the worst shape of the problem. He could face a decision, however it went. What he could not easily face was the interval between now and the decision. 30 days of not knowing whether the shack was his, whether the work was his, whether the 23 shoulder drops had happened in a place that would continue to exist for the people who needed it. He thought about Bess Holloway, reading to her brother by this fire. He thought about Pearl standing in the center of the room, looking at the flames and calling them pretty. He thought about the grip of Emmett's hands. He thought about Agnes, coming every Wednesday, bringing what she thought was needed. He thought about what she had said. The most straightforwardly honest person I've met. He thought about the weight of that, said plainly, not as flattery. He thought about what happened if Fitch won the review. If the sale was invalidated, he had $40 coming back and nowhere to put it, and the improvements reverted, and the shack became again what it had been when he arrived, a ruin beside a stream that people drove past to feel better about where they were going. He sat with that for a long time. The fire needed wood. He put wood on it because the fire needed it regardless of his feelings, and went on. The 30 days were the longest of his life, which had contained some long days. He kept the waypoint running with the deliberate normalcy of a man who will not allow uncertainty to interrupt necessary work. He kept the fire, stacked the wood, minded the stores, received 4 more visitors in January and 2 in early February. He did not mention the review to any of them, because it was his problem and not theirs, and they had come for warmth and not for his troubles. He told Cobb. Cobb listened and said, "Whatever Cross wrote in that notebook mattered. He's a thorough man." He told Agnes on the first Wednesday of February, when the cold had moderated enough that she arrived with her coat unbuttoned and color in her face from the ride rather than from cold alone. She sat with it quietly for a moment and then said, "What happens to you if you lose it?" He had been thinking about this for 30 days and had arrived at a clear answer. "I leave," he said. "There's no point in staying in Alder Ridge if I have no place here." She looked at him. "You have a place here that's not the shack." "Not yet," he said. "Maybe. But the shack is how I showed up. It's how I became something in this place rather than something passing through. If it goes, I go back to passing through." Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "I came the first Wednesday," she said slowly, "because Cobb told me someone had fixed the Fitch shack, and I wanted to see what kind of person does that. I came the second Wednesday because I liked what I'd seen. I came every Wednesday after that for a different reason, which I think you know." Jonah looked at her. "The shack is remarkable," she said. "What you made of it is remarkable. But Jonah, it was never the shack I came back for." He sat with that. "I'm not saying the property doesn't matter," she said. "I'm saying that what you are doesn't live in the property. You'd take it with you if you left. I've known you long enough to be certain of that." He thought about Dewey Marsh and the grip of both hands in a Wyoming blizzard. He thought about the boy and what he had carried from that moment for 8 years without knowing what it was or what to do with it. He thought about what he had done with it finally, not to process it or resolve it, but simply to act on what it had told him, which was that warmth shared was different in kind from warmth hoarded. He had built something. Whatever the review decided, he had built it. The chimneys he had repaired were repaired. The walls he had sealed were sealed. The 23 people who had been warm were warm, permanently, in the way that experiences lodge in memory and don't vacate. Fitch's lawyer could have the timber. He couldn't have what the timber had been made into. Jonah looked at Agnes and said, "Stay for supper." It was not the thing he meant most, but it was the thing he could say, and she heard what it carried. "I'll stay," she said. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on February 12th, delivered by Pell with the careful expression of a man who knows the weight of what he's carrying. Jonah took it. He put it on the shelf and made coffee first, because he had come to believe that no document should be read cold. He poured a cup, sat down on the sleeping shelf, and opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages. He read it twice. He put it back in the envelope and sat for a moment, with the particular stillness that follows a decision that resolves something long suspended. Then he got his coat and walked down the track to Cobb's, which was 2 miles, and he walked it in the February cold, with his hands in his pockets and his mind turning over what came next. Not what the letter said, but what the letter made possible. He arrived at Cobb's and knocked. Cobb opened the door and looked at him and read his face and said, "Come in." Jonah came in and sat down and said, "I need to send word to Agnes." Cobb did not ask about the letter. He went to his desk and produced paper and said, "Write it." Jonah wrote a note. It was 3 lines. He gave it to Cobb, and Cobb said he'd have it carried today. On the walk back, Jonah began planning what came next. The review finding had been 14 pages long in its full original form, though the 3-page letter summarized it clearly enough. The board had found, first, that the original sale of the property had been conducted in good faith by both parties, and that no evidence supported the claim of undisclosed commercial intent. The finding specifically noted that a man purchasing a property for $40 with no income and a single dollar remaining in his possession could not, by any reasonable inference, be understood to have had commercial development in mind. The word drifter, used twice in Fitch's lawyer's filing, had been noted by the board and treated as prejudicial rather than factual, inasmuch as a man's prior occupation was not relevant to the good faith of a property transaction. Second, the board had found that the improvements made to the property were the result of legitimate labor and investment by the current owner and constituted, in the board's assessment, a substantial increase in the property's value and utility. The board attached a valuation prepared by an assessor sent separately from Cross that placed the improved property's fair value at considerably more than $40. The specific figure was $180, which made the original sale price, if anything, favorable to the seller and not to the buyer. Third, and this was the paragraph Jonah had read twice, the registration of the Creel waypoint was confirmed in full. The suspension of the quarterly stipend was lifted with back payment owed for the missed quarter, and the waypoint was formally designated a Tier 1 emergency shelter on the Eastern Ridge Passage route, a designation that came with a modest annual maintenance grant from the Territorial Relief Fund. Fitch's complaint was dismissed. His lawyer's supplemental filing regarding the improvements was noted and rejected. The property was Jonah Creel's, confirmed in law, in assessment, and in the record of 23, now 29, visits by travelers who had needed warmth and found it. Jonah had not leaped or shouted or done anything of that kind when he read it. He had sat still the way he sat with everything important and let it settle into the proper place. But now, 3 days after receiving the letter, he was moving. He had sent word to Agnes and to Cobb, and through Cobb to Hattie Briggs and to Ruth Haskell, and Pell had carried a note to Dr. Munn's last known address with the uncertain optimism of postal service in territory that was still working out its geography. He had sent word, specifically, that he would be grateful if people would come to the shack on the afternoon of February 15th, which was a Sunday, and that he would have food enough for a gathering. What he had not sent, because it was too large for a note and required his own voice, was what he intended to say. He spent the 2 days before the gathering cooking with the methodical focus he gave to all work that mattered. He made a pot of dried bean soup that he seasoned with dried sage and a piece of smoked beef that Cobb had produced without being asked, in the particular Cobb way of providing what was needed slightly before it was requested. He made cornbread in the skillet, 4 batches, each one rested on the stone apron while the next cooked. He put Dr. Munn's candy in a bowl at the center of the shelf. He swept the floor. It was still dirt. It would always be dirt. That was the nature of the floor. And he swept it clean with the broom he'd made in November from bundled fir branches tied with twine. He restacked the cups. He put the books Agnes had brought in a row on the shelf, spines out, which looked like something. He made sure the wood box was full and that the fire was built up enough that the room would be warm before anyone arrived. Then he sat down and waited, which was the one thing he was not good at, and in which he was getting better. Cobb arrived first, because Cobb was always early, which was one of the reliable things about him. He came in, looked at the room, and said, "You cleaned." "I swept," Jonah said. "In here it's the same thing." Cobb sat down and accepted coffee and said, "The finding was right." "I know," Jonah said. "Fitch will quiet down," Cobb said. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who is wrong and won't say so, which is uncomfortable to be, but it passes." "I bear him no trouble," Jonah said. This was true. He had examined it carefully and found that it was true, which surprised him mildly. He thought what he thought, people do. Hattie Briggs arrived next, a small, bright-eyed woman of 68 who had produced the quilts and who looked at the shack with proprietary satisfaction, as people do when they've contributed to a thing. Ruth Haskell came behind her, steady and observant as always, and took in the room in her characteristic 4-second assessment and produced a nod. Agnes came last, which was not her usual order. She came in with snow on her shoulders from a brief squall that had come through, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room full of people and the soup on the fire and the cornbread on the apron and the candy in the bowl and Jonah standing in the center of it all. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Come in," he said. "There's heat." They ate together around the fire, which was the original furniture of humanity and needed no other arrangement. The soup was good. Jonah knew it was good in the specific way of a person who has cooked long enough to know when they've gotten it right. And the cornbread held together properly, which was a small and complete satisfaction. Hattie Briggs declared it better than anything she'd eaten since August. Cobb ate 2 portions without comment, which was his highest form of compliment. Ruth Haskell asked about the seasoning with genuine culinary interest, and Jonah told her, sage from Dr. Munn, smoke from Cobb's beef, nothing else. Dr. Munn, as it happened, had received the note and had made the extraordinary decision to turn his wagon around from wherever he'd been headed and come back to the ridge. He arrived 40 minutes after the gathering began, stamping his boots on the threshold stone and declaring the timing of the squall a personal insult, and was received with the warmth that communities extend to reliable characters. "The candy is in a bowl," Jonah told him. Dr. Munn looked at the bowl and looked at the gathering and said, "No children?" "Not today." "Saving it for children," Dr. Munn said firmly, and sat down and ate soup. When they had eaten, Jonah stood. This required a modest effort, not physically, but in terms of the habit of not speaking in front of groups, which was a very old habit. He said, "I want to tell you what this place is." He said it to all of them and none of them specifically, looking at the walls rather than the people, because looking at the walls was looking at the evidence. When I bought it, it was a ruin. Everybody in Alder Ridge knew that. I was a drifter, that's the word they used. And I bought a ruin for everything I had, and that seemed to people like one kind of story. A story about a man who had nothing going somewhere to have less. He paused. "It's a different story. I didn't know what kind when I started. I know now." He turned from the wall and looked at them. 29 people have come through here. Not because I advertised, not because I charged them, because it was cold and they needed heat, and this shack was here and real. Every one of them. Their shoulders went down when they understood that. He touched the stone face of the chimney. "I built this because I knew how and because I had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. I didn't expect it to become anything beyond a place to sleep out of the weather." He looked at Agnes. "It became more than that because of people who saw what it was and said so. Cobb, who came and asked the right questions. Ruth, who sent a list. Hattie, who made blankets without being asked. Agnes—" He stopped, because the next words required care, and he had not, he realized, rehearsed this part. "Agnes came every Wednesday," he said. "She brought what she thought was needed. She was always right about what was needed, including things I didn't know I needed." He said this plainly, which was the only way he knew to say anything, and the plainness of it was its own kind of eloquence. Agnes was looking at the fire with the expression of a person who has been given something they expected and still finds it affecting. "The land office decided the property is mine," Jonah continued, recovering his thread. "It was always mine, in the ways that matter. But now it's mine, in the ways the law tracks as well. And that means decisions about what it becomes can be made." He turned to face all of them. "I want it to be more than a waypoint. I want it to be a proper place, bigger. I'm thinking about a second room off the north wall with a second hearth, sleeping capacity for 12, a proper woodshed instead of a tarp, a root cellar for stores that stay cold without freezing." He had written this list the night before. "I can do most of it myself. The second hearth I'll need help with. I'd need someone who knows stone and mortar better than I do." "I know a mason in Prairie City," Cobb said, without looking up from his cup. "I'll need lumber beyond what I can fell alone." The Halverson mill will cut it at a reasonable rate, Ruth said. I know the foreman's wife. I'll need money I don't have yet, some of it. A silence, and then Hattie Briggs said, without particular drama, I'll give $20. I've been looking for a thing to give money to. Cobb said, 10. Ruth said, 10 at the same moment. Doctor, Munn said, I'll match whatever the school teachers give, which appears to be 20 combined, so 20 from me, and ate another spoonful of soup. Jonah stood very still. Agnes stood up from her place by the fire and crossed the room and stood before him and said, in a voice just for the two of them, $40. He looked at her. The same as the shack cost, she said. It seems right. He looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, in the same register, come on the Wednesdays and the other days too. She said, I had been planning to. Spring came to the ridge in the particular order it always did, first as a smell in the air, a loosening of the cold's grip that was more felt than measured, then as mud on the track where the sun could reach it, then as sound. The stream waking up from its January silence, moving again with the purposeful noise of water that has somewhere to go. By April, the second room was framed. Jonah had hired the mason from Prairie City, a careful craftsman named Webb, who laid the second hearth with lime mortar and full-cut stone in 8 days' work, and left Jonah a hand-drawn diagram of the construction in case future repairs were needed. The root cellar was dug and lined with flat stones from the stream bank. The woodshed stood properly, with a roof and 3 walls and a front that opened south into the sun. The floor of the original room was still dirt. Jonah had looked at plank flooring and priced it and decided that the dirt floor was honest and would remain, at least for now. Some things didn't need improving. The Waypoint was registered as a Tier 1 shelter in late February's confirming paperwork, and in March the first quarterly payment plus the back payment arrived via Pell in a small envelope that Jonah put in the coffee tin with the original letter and the review finding, because the coffee tin had become, more or less, the archive of how the place had come to be what it was. He thought someone should know that story. He thought he might write it down eventually, when the building work was done. Agnes came every day now, not just Wednesdays, which was what she'd said she'd planned and what she'd done. She came in the mornings when school permitted and on weekends without reservation, and she brought what she thought was needed, which continued to be accurate. She had brought curtains for the windows of the new room, proper curtains, oilskin lined, with a small wooden rod she'd had Cobb hang. She had brought seeds for a kitchen garden on the south side of the shack, not because it was urgent, but because she was thinking about summers. She had brought, on a Saturday in April, herself, without anything else, and sat in the sun on the flat threshold stone and read while Jonah worked on the woodshed, and the stream ran nearby, and the ridge made its large, unhurried sounds. He stopped working at midday and sat beside her on the threshold stone, and she marked her page and put the book down, and they sat together in the spring light without speaking, which was one of the things about Agnes that he had come to understand was rare. She did not fill silence that didn't need filling. After a while she said, "What are you going to call it?" "The bigger version." "It's still the Creel place," he said. "That's a name. I meant what you're going to call it in your own mind." He thought about it. He thought about the February gathering, the soup, the cornbread, the shoulders going down. He thought about Della Holloway at the door saying the children will talk about this their whole lives. He thought about Pearl, 4 years old, standing in the center of the room looking at the fire and saying simply, "It's pretty." "Home," he said. "I'll call it home." Agnes picked up her book again and leaned her shoulder against his, and the stream ran past, and the light was warm, and the ridge was large and full of ordinary, enduring life. The snow comes sideways on the night Jonah Creel saves 4 lives. He does not think of it that way. He thinks only of the fire, whether the stones will hold their heat, whether the moss chinking will keep the wind from finding the gaps. And then he remembers that there are no gaps, not anymore, that he pressed every one of them shut with patient hands months ago, and they have held through every storm since. Inside the shack, both rooms of it, a woman wrings out a child's stocking near the hearth. Two ranch hands sit against the wall with their knees drawn up, watching the flames with the particular stillness of men who recently understood they might die. In the new room, Agnes is making up the sleeping shelves with Hattie Briggs's quilts, moving efficiently in the lamplight, knowing where everything is because she has always known where everything is. The kettle whistles. Jonah lifts it without ceremony and begins to pour. He fills the cups in order, smallest to largest, the way they are nested on the shelf, a system no one asked for and everyone uses. The woman with the stocking looks up and says, "Thank you." He sets a cup near her. He nods. Nobody is laughing at him now. Nobody is driving past to feel better about where they're headed. They are here, in the warmth that he made from nothing and kept through everything. And the fire holds, and the walls hold, and outside the ridge is white and enormous and indifferent. Inside, it is not cold. That is the whole of it, and it is enough, and it is more than enough.